The next lines deepened until they felt like they were pressing straight into the center of my chest, the handwriting turning softer in places as though her hand had trembled when she wrote it, and I could almost see her sitting somewhere quiet, trying to force clarity out of a mind already slipping away. She wrote about the years when the fog thickened, when my presence became the silent anchor she leaned on, even when she couldn't remember, why she trusted me so instinctively, when she began leaving cabinet doors open and losing track of entire afternoons, when she woke in rooms she didn't recognize and looked to me before she looked to herself. She described how I reorganized her world without letting her feel the shift, how I made sure every meeting had someone else ready to step in before anyone noticed she no longer understood half the numbers she was approving, how I practiced conversations with her the night before so she could greet people with the confidence she used to carry naturally. She said she knew exactly when the elder one started bragging to her friends about how sharp her mother still was, how strong she remained, how extraordinary her resilience seemed, and she admitted a terrible truth, that hearing those praises felt like betrayal and mercy at the same time. I was the one making those illusions possible, and she let me. She confessed. She watched the elder one, admire her steady voice on the phone, without realizing the notes I had prepared were sitting just out of frame, that she listened to compliments about her leadership while ignoring the trembling in her own hands under the table. And she wrote that every time the elder one walked away proud, she wanted to reach out and tell her the truth, but she could never force the words to leave her mouth because she could not bear to watch the older child learn the woman she admired was already slipping away. The message shifted then, moving into the years when she could no longer pretend, when even with my help she began to forget the layout of her own house, when she stood in front of sinks and mirrors without recognizing them, when she left the stove on and blamed the smell on the neighbors. She wrote about the morning she stared at her own reflection and didn't know who was looking back, and how she stayed in that bathroom for nearly an hour until I found her, wrapped my arms around her, and reminded her that she was safe. She wrote that I became her compass, her anchor, the quiet force she followed even when she didn't understand where she was going, and that the shame of relying on her child like that haunted her more than the illness itself. She confessed that when the decline forced her into the memory facility, she made me swear to tell the elder one it was her choice, that she simply wanted to simplify her life, that she was tired of managing such a large home. She said she knew I hated lying, hated the way I had to twist my voice to protect the elder one from a truth that would have shattered her, but she insisted, and she felt the weight of that request every day afterward. Then her words turned heavier, the ink slightly darker, as if she pressed the pen harder at that part. She wrote that she knew exactly what she took from me, the career I abandoned, the future I never built, the relationships I let fade, the years spent in a small apartment with barely enough space for a life of my own. She wrote that she had watched the elder one climb higher and higher, celebrated her victories, saw her face in newspapers, listened to her describe her flawless world, all while knowing her other child was quietly burning pieces of his own life to keep hers from collapsing. She admitted she had wanted to tell the elder one everything 1,000 times, but every attempt dissolved into fear. Fear that the elder one would break under the guilt, fear that the two of us would fracture beyond repair, fear that she would become a burden instead of a mother. So instead she wrote the only truth she could leave behind, that the entire reason she shifted her empire into my hands was not favoritism or affection, measured incorrectly, but repayment. A late, imperfect repayment. For 8 years I gave her without ever asking for anything. She wrote that the older child would be furious, confused, devastated, that the truth would hit like a storm and crack the version of our family she had carried like scripture, but she believed time would make room for understanding. She said she hoped the elder one would not view me as the thief of her inheritance, but as the quiet guardian who kept her mother's dignity intact. And then the final blow came. She wrote that she chose to leave this truth on paper because she had run out of courage while she was alive, because she had waited too long, because the secret had grown so large she no longer knew how to speak it. She begged for forgiveness, not for her illness, not for the decline she couldn't stop, but for the silence she kept. Her last line trembled more than any other. She wrote that if she had been braver, none of us would be standing in that room learning the truth in ink instead of in her voice. And when I reached that sentence, something in me broke open, a quiet, shaking thing that had been locked away for years, because for the first time the past felt unbearably real, instead of something I had survived on autopilot. The room slowly came back into focus as the last lines of her message settled inside me like something raw and unfinished. And when I finally lifted my eyes from the pages, the elder one was already watching me, her face drained of color, the thin sheet she had been given lying open in front of her like it had delivered a blow she hadn't braced for. She whispered that I had taken care of the woman who raised us, not as a question but as a realization slipping loose from a place she had never looked into, and when I answered, her voice trembled like she was struggling to hold on to the person she had been 5 minutes ago. She said she had believed every story I fed her, every explanation about why the woman who raised us sounded distracted, why she repeated herself, why she seemed distant on days when the fog was thickest, and she pressed a hand against her mouth like she was trying to stop the truth from rising too fast. I stepped away from the table because the air had become too tight, too heavy, and I found myself standing at the window looking down at the city the woman who raised us, once shaped with her own ambition, the world she had entrusted to me in ways I still could not understand. The elder one said she called every week and never saw anything, said she visited every month and thought the woman who raised us was simply aging, said she assumed the exhaustion in her mother's eyes was something temporary. I told her we rehearsed those calls, that I stood just out of sight ready to step in when words slipped away, that I filled the silences before she could notice them, that I stayed awake some nights, rewriting the script for the next morning so the older child would believe everything was still intact. She pressed her fingers against the glass on her side of the room as if she needed to feel something solid, and she whispered that she had never imagined how much of the woman she admired had already been crumbling in my hands. The space between us felt like a decade of misunderstanding, stretched tight, and she finally said she wasn't sure she could read the rest of what the woman who raised us had left because she didn't know if she could survive, knowing how much she had missed. I told her she needed to read every word, that the truth was hers too, that the woman who raised us wanted both of us to carry it, not just me. She shook her head, tears slipping without hesitation, and said she had spent years believing she was the strong one, the successful one, the child who made the woman who raised us proud, and the confession that she had been blind all that time cracked her open, so completely she had to grip the back of a chair to stay upright. I crossed the room without thinking and pulled her into my arms. At first she stayed rigid as if she didn't trust herself to lean on anyone, but then her body folded against mine with the same desperate weight she used to collapse with when we were children, and she woke shaking from dreams she couldn't describe. She kept saying she was sorry, again and again, whispering apologies into my shoulder like they had been trapped in her for years, waiting for a moment when she couldn't hold them back. I held her until the shaking eased, until her breaths grew less sharp, until the rain against the glass became the only steady thing in the room. When she finally pulled away, she wiped her face with the back of her hand, straightened her jacket like she needed something familiar to cling to, and asked what happened next. I told her I didn't know how someone like me was supposed to run an empire, that I had spent years teaching teenagers how to read stories instead of managing properties, that I felt like someone had handed me a world I wasn't built for. She said I had already done more than anyone realized, that I had kept the entire structure from collapsing while the woman who raised us was fading, that I had proven I could carry weight without announcing it to anyone. I admitted I couldn't do it alone. Not anymore. Not after spending years pretending I didn't need help from anyone. She looked at me with eyes still swollen from tears and said she wanted to help if I would let her, that she didn't want to lose any more years to pride or silence. I nodded because I finally believed that neither of us needed to stand apart the way we had for so long. She reached out and squeezed my hand, and in that small gesture I felt something shift, something broken slipping into a new shape. We walked out together a minute later, side by side for the first time in what felt like another lifetime, and for a brief, fragile moment it seemed possible that the truth, as devastating as it was, might finally make room for both of us in the same story. When we stepped into the hallway, the air felt different, thinner somehow, like the room we had left had stolen a piece of the past from both of us and locked it inside with the papers on the table. The elevator ride was quiet, not the strained silence we used to carry around each other, but something softer, something uncertain, as if neither of us knew how to speak now that the truth had rearranged the shape of our family. When we reached the lobby, she turned to me with that faint, unsteady look people get when they realize the ground beneath them was never what they thought, and she said she was going to take the message the woman who raised us left for me and read every line no matter how much it hurt. I told her I would answer every question afterward, even the ones she didn't know how to ask yet. She nodded, squeezed my hand one more time, and disappeared toward the parking area, her steps slow like she was carrying something new and heavy and fragile all at once. Then it was just me standing there, with the envelope pressed to my chest as if it were a living thing. Outside, the drizzle had softened to a thin mist that clung to the sidewalk, and when I reached my old car, the smell of damp fabric enveloped me in a strange comfort. I sat there for a long moment, with the city rising around me like a world I had never been invited into. The kind of place where people carried briefcases and spoke with confidence about markets and projections. The kind of world the woman who raised us had built from the ground up long before I understood what ambition meant. I rested the envelope on the passenger seat, its weight familiar now, and I thought about the life I had crafted in the small apartment miles away, the life of early mornings, classrooms, stacks of unread essays, evenings that slipped by quietly while I cooked simple meals and listened to the rain. It had been a life I chose, or at least a life I convinced myself I chose, and now it was colliding with a reality I had never imagined. I started the engine and pulled into the slow-moving traffic. The world smeared on the windshield in streaks of grey, and as I merged onto the highway, something inside me loosened in a way I hadn't felt in years. Not relief exactly, not joy, but a strange lightness, as if the secret I had carried for so long had finally stepped out of my body and taken its place in the open air where it belonged. I thought about the elder one, about the tears she hadn't tried to hide, about how she had looked at me like she was seeing the truth for the first time, about the possibility that this revelation might finally bend the rigid shape of her pride into something more human. I thought about the woman who raised us writing those lines, with hands that trembled more days than not, choosing ink because she no longer had the strength to choose voice, giving me the final piece of a story that had been incomplete for too long. The road stretched ahead, wet and glimmering under the grey sky, and I felt the smallest pull toward the quiet apartment waiting for me miles away, a familiar world untouched by inheritance or boardrooms or the jagged edges of old wounds. But behind that familiarity came the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again, that the next morning would pull me into rooms I didn't understand, into decisions I wasn't certain I could make, into responsibilities the woman who raised us had believed I could handle even when I doubted it myself. I tightened my grip on the wheel and let the thought settle. I wasn't carrying her secret alone anymore. The elder one knew now. She understood enough to feel the crack in her own certainty, enough to meet me in the truth instead of standing above it. Time would work on the rest. It always did. The city lights faded behind me as I drove through the thinning rain, the envelope shifting slightly with each turn, and for the first time in 8 years, I felt something unfamiliar stirring at the edge of all the exhaustion, something quiet and tentative. It wasn't hope exactly, not yet, but it was close enough that I let it sit beside me as the highway opened ahead, leading me back toward the life I had built piece by careful piece and forward into the one I had never expected to inherit.